welcome back to Shop Chronicles. We're going on a field trip. A lot of people have been asking how the Cusco Zero 3Rs are working out. And I've been driving around with them long enough that I can give you kind of the initial impressions. And before we even get into that, the first thing I want to remind you is that when I picked everything for this go-round of replacing the suspension, track performance was the priority, not comfort, not daily driving, none of that stuff. So are these things firm? Yes, they are. And the first time I drove home with them, we were actually in a snowstorm. We hadn't quite aligned everything. There's a lot of snow and ice on the ground, and it's pretty rough. Kind of thought that I'd maybe ruin the car a little bit. And we're coming up on some railroad tracks. I'm going to go slow over these things. You can kind of see it's reasonably jarring. The car feels almost a little bit, I would almost say even a little bit nervous going over bumps. But all the suspension's been replaced, all the bushings. The car feels really, really tight now. It feels very much like a new car, which it should, because there's basically the only thing in the suspension that was left from previous is the trailing arms. When you have a coilover that's like improperly adjusted or is running too low, a lot of times, a lot of the stiffness that you run into in the car is because you're basically riding on the bump stops. And that's not how we set these things up, and that's not how these Zero 3Rs are supposed to work. And so there's a difference here. In part, it's a difference down to the spring rates, but it's also down to the Monotube suspension. What Monotubes do really well is they absorb big bumps really well. They're big tubes, you have a lot of fluid, they do that really well. What they don't do well is react quickly to small bumps, whereas twin tube suspensions, or twin tube struts, they are able to react very quickly to small movements, but where they start to struggle is with the bigger bumps. So as I've driven the car more and more with these, I mean, we're going over some seams, you can probably see it's a little bit bumpy. You get a lot of information from the road. The trade-off here is because these are big Monotube inverted shocks, any kind of big bumps actually are absorbed pretty darn well. Now the other thing that I've noticed with this is because the spring rates are so high, the car is held quite flat. Now the other thing that's worth mentioning here is I played with the sway bars. I don't think I've mentioned this. Basically up front, there is no sway bar. I took the sway bar off entirely so that the front suspension is completely independent. Now in the rear, what I did is I went back to the stock wagon rear sway bar, which is only 17 millimeters, so it's a very skinny rear bar, and that's it. Car still feels very neutral, but I have not pushed it to the point where it's going to start breaking traction. So it's possible that 17 millimeter rear bar might actually even be too much with no front bar. When I do get this thing to the track, that's probably the first point where I'll find that out. And if it's too much, I'll just disconnect the inlinks and just run without sway bars for that first track day. In the corners, the car is really, really fun. It really feels like it has a lot of grip, and the characteristics of the car have changed a reasonable amount. And it's one of those things that I want to explore on the track for sure, but even just driving around, like once you get moving and everything smooths out, the car's a lot of fun. With all the extra caster up front, so if you remember, we changed the front control arms, we've got the front ball joints. The caster is now up to about 6.2 degrees. We're running about 3 degrees negative camber all the way around. The car just feels like it has a lot of traction in the corners. I've not changed tires yet. Tires that are on the car are, let's see, Continental Extreme Contact DWS that are, I think, around 10 years old. I just, they're all seasons, and I just haven't really driven the car enough to replace them. Though I am getting some inter-edge wear up front, so it's probably getting close to time. Let's just say that they're not great. But again, the car still seems to handle pretty well. And there are new wheels and tires that I just honestly haven't had a chance to mount up yet. But hopefully soon we'll have some good summer tires on. And then pretty much that, and maybe just a couple other details, and we're ready to take this to the track and see what it does, see what it's like. But overall, thus far, I'm really impressed with the changes that are made to the suspension. Is it something that, like, if I was only daily driving the car, would I make all the same choices? Probably not. But it would actually be a harder choice than I thought. I honestly expected the 03Rs to be a little bit more of a significant compromise for driving on the road than they have been so far. It's not something I'd want to like spend 3 days on a road trip in necessarily, but it's not too bad. So in terms of ride height, it's exactly the same ride height as when I had the other coilover set at, which is about an inch lower than stock, but that's it. So the car is sitting reasonably high. But having the car sitting up a little bit more gives us a little bit better suspension geometry to work with, and really like no drama in the corners. And I really want to get out and push it and just see what it does. And there's a lot of little seams in this road, and you feel every one of them. And it's a little bit jarring, but it's not terrible. What I discovered that was really interesting after driving into work is there's train tracks that drive over every day getting to the shop. First few days took them really slowly, just to try and minimize the bumps and everything like that. What I came to discover was that actually if I didn't slow down for them and actually just took them at speed, it took the car to go way better. And I think that's where all of a sudden, like taking the railroad tracks faster, so there's a little bit bigger of an impact, then the coilovers were able to just absorb it much more easily than basically a lot of small low-speed ones. And then actually pulling into the parking lot was actually the other thing that was interesting, because there's a really big big curb that you go up to get into our parking lot, and that actually is not nearly as bad as the small stuff. You feel it more in the rear than in the front. The front is able to absorb the bump better than the rear almost. I think that's in part because there's no sway bar up front, so it just independently moves. As we've been shooting this video, I've been thinking about it. I'm reminded of it like a time way back at the beginning when a friend gave me a ride in his wagon. He had the KYB AGX adjustable struts on full stiff, of course, because stiffer is better, stiffer is faster. And he had the Team S-Tech lowering springs because lower is better. That was like the very definition of a punishing ride. Remember, we were driving and there's a little rain seam in the road, and he hit it at speed, and I think I saw stars. I also think I shrunk about 2 inches that day. And when I first put these coilovers on my car, that's kind of the concern that I had. The high spring rates, the 12 kilogram front, 9 kilogram rear springs. Was I going to have to live with that kind of a ride every day, so that in theory I'd have a better car at the track? That's what I was afraid of, and that's not what happened. That's not at all what this is. And I think that's the difference with this kind of a monotube, race suspension compared to, something like a very short travel, or an improperly set up coilover, or a very overdamped suspension setup. There's a lot of feedback initially, but when the suspension needs to do work and soak up the bumps, it does. And that's what I was really pleased to find out. The thing that I like the most about it, in thinking about it, is that the suspension is stiff enough that when you go into a corner, when you're like on the brakes going into a corner, it actually feels like you're loading up the tires, not like you are basically loading up the suspension and then the tires. There's just a lot more immediate feedback from the tires when you're braking or you're cornering. That also makes the car feel like it's a lot more responsive when you're on the brakes or going into a corner, because the suspension is holding everything firmly, but it's just doing that minimal amount of action and really transferring all of that weight to the tires to get them to do what they need to do. And so from that standpoint, I really like this. I have not played around with the rebound settings yet. I don't feel like I know enough about how the car handles yet, or what it's going to do, to really start tinkering with that. So that's down the road. But so far, I like them. I'm more that I drive on these 03Rs, the more that I like them. And I bet you as soon as I get them to the track, well, I mean, it's probably going to be phenomenal, but at least that's my fingers crossed hope. But yeah, so that's where I'm at with them. So to sum up, would I recommend these Cusco Zero 3Rs for a street-driven car? Probably not. Would I recommend them for a car that sees 1, maybe 2 track days in a year? Also probably not. I mean, if you're doing 1 or 2 track days a year, but you are running R compound tires, like really sticky race tires, then maybe. But really, I mean, this is definitely more track-oriented suspension. So that's where we're at. Thanks very much for watching. Really appreciate your support as always. And until next time, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.